The wind rustled through the towering pine trees, carrying the crisp, unmistakable scent of autumn. The Rocky Mountain National Park was quiet that evening, only the occasional bird call or distant crunch of footsteps on gravel breaking the stillness. And then a scream. A single piercing cry, followed by silence. By the time first responders arrived, darkness was creeping in. They found her at the base of a jagged cliff, motionless, broken. Her name was Toni Henthorn, a successful ophthalmologist, a devoted mother, and a woman with everything to live for. She had come here with her husband, Harold Henthorn, on what was supposed to be a romantic weekend getaway for their wedding anniversary, a celebration of love, of commitment. Instead, it ended in tragedy. Harold's story was simple. She was taking pictures, he told rescuers. She just slipped. A horrible accident, he insisted. One tragic step too close to the edge. But as authorities surveyed the scene, something felt off. Why had they been hiking on this particular trail, a remote, difficult route that even experienced hikers would approach with caution? Why was Toni's purse found neatly placed 100 feet away from the fall site, as if she had been asked to set it down before stepping closer? And then there was Harold himself. His reaction wasn't what you'd expect from a grieving husband. There were no frantic sobs, no shaking hands, no collapsing in devastation. Instead, his voice was calm, almost too calm. And within minutes of emergency responders arriving, he started talking about something no one else had even considered: life insurance. Not Toni, not his wife's death, but insurance paperwork. Before anyone had even confirmed she was gone. That's when authorities had their first gut feeling this wasn't just an accident. This was something much, much worse. But if Toni hadn't slipped, then what really happened on that mountain? And why? People fall on hikes all the time. It's tragic, but it happens. Slippery rocks, loose gravel, sudden gusts of wind. A single misstep can be the difference between life and death. But this case, it didn't fit the pattern of an ordinary fall. Let's break it down. Harold said she lost her footing while taking pictures. But according to her family and friends, Toni wasn't the kind of person to recklessly step near the edge of a cliff. She was cautious, responsible, and afraid of heights. Would she really have risked her life for a better view? The location itself was suspicious. This wasn't a well-known tourist area with safety railings and designated lookout points. It was remote, dangerous, a place that required careful planning to reach. Why would Harold bring her here to one of the most treacherous areas in the park instead of choosing a safer, more romantic hike? Then there was the way she fell. Experts later examined the scene and noticed something strange. Toni's injuries suggested she hadn't just tripped and tumbled down. She had gone straight over, like she had been pushed. And what about Harold's reaction? Witnesses at the scene later said he wasn't panicked. He wasn't begging for help, clutching at rescuers, or sobbing uncontrollably. Instead, he was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. And then, in the middle of everything, the flashing lights, the paramedics working to recover Toni's body, he casually asks, "How soon can I get the insurance paperwork started?" Wait, what? His wife had just plunged to her death, and he was already thinking about insurance. That's when authorities felt it. That undeniable, gut-wrenching instinct that something wasn't right. Was this really a terrible accident? Or had Harold been waiting for this moment all along? Investigators couldn't shake the feeling that something about Harold Henthorn's story wasn't adding up. So they started digging. And what they found? It shattered the image of the loving, doting husband that Harold had carefully crafted for years. First, there were the lies about his career. Harold told everyone he was a wealthy businessman, that he made his fortune in real estate, that he was so successful. Toni didn't even need to worry about money, he had it all covered. But when investigators looked into his financial records, the truth came crashing down. There were no real estate transactions, no business ventures, no steady income. Bank accounts practically empty, debt piling up. And Toni, she had no idea. Harold had been lying to her for years, controlling every single dollar, every bank account, every financial decision. Why? What kind of husband keeps his wife in the dark about everything? Unless he was planning something. And then came the most disturbing discovery of all. This wasn't the first time Harold had been involved in a tragic accident. Because Toni Henthorn wasn't his first wife, and his first wife. She died under mysterious circumstances too. What comes next? With this revelation, the story takes a dark and chilling turn. Who was Harold's first wife? How did she die? And was Toni's death truly a freak accident or part of a deadly pattern? The deeper authorities dug, the more disturbing the truth became. And when they uncovered the evidence hidden in Harold's past, his entire house of lies came crashing down. But could they prove he was a killer? The moment investigators uncovered the truth about Harold's past, everything changed. This wasn't his first wife. And it wasn't the first time he had been the last person to see his wife alive. Her name was Sandra Lynn Henthorn. Years before he married Toni, Harold had been widowed once before. The official story, a tragic freak accident. Harold claimed they had been driving along a deserted road when they got a flat tire. Sandra, always eager to help, had stepped out of the car to assist him. And then the jack gave out. The car suddenly collapsed on her, crushing her chest and killing her instantly. No witnesses, no dashcam footage, no bystanders. Just Harold and a story that no one could prove or disprove. At the time, police ruled it an accident, a horrible stroke of bad luck, a grieving husband with nothing but sorrow in his eyes. But now, with Toni dead under equally suspicious circumstances, it didn't feel like bad luck anymore. It felt like a pattern. Sandra had one terrifying thing in common with Toni, a massive life insurance policy. And Harold, he was the sole beneficiary. When detectives dug deeper, the similarities between Sandra's accident and Toni's became impossible to ignore. The sudden, isolated death. No eyewitnesses. A bizarre, unlikely accident. A life insurance payout waiting for Harold. And then, the most chilling discovery of all. Harold had switched out Sandra's tires just weeks before her accident. He had even taken the car to the shop for a checkup, but no mechanic could recall seeing anything wrong with it. And when Sandra's family begged the police to investigate, Harold shut them down immediately. He threatened legal action, dismissed their suspicions as wild accusations, and played the role of the grieving, heartbroken widower so perfectly that no one dared to question him. For years, no one saw the truth. Until now. Could a man really stage two separate murders years apart and get away with both? Detectives needed to prove it. But how? Sandra's case was cold, buried under years of dust. But Toni's, it was fresh. And if Harold had planned her death, there had to be evidence. They needed to show that Toni's fall wasn't an accident, that Harold had lured her there for a reason. And then they got their first major breakthrough. Her phone. It was the one thing Harold couldn't control. And inside it, they found exactly what they needed. Harold told investigators that the hike was spontaneous, a last-minute idea, a romantic anniversary getaway into nature. He described it as a way to reconnect, just the two of them with no distractions. But Toni's phone told a different story. When investigators pulled the GPS data from her device, they found something that shattered Harold's narrative completely. He had been to that exact location before, not once, not twice, but multiple times, and each time he had been alone. Why would a man return to the same remote, treacherous spot over and over again without his wife? There was no reason for him to be there. No hiking trails led to that specific cliff. It wasn't a well-known viewpoint. It wasn't somewhere a couple would normally go for a romantic outing. Unless he had been scouting it. Unless he had been preparing something. Unless he had been planning this moment long before Toni even set foot on that trail. And if that was true, then this wasn't an accident at all. Crime scene investigators analyzed the details of Toni's fall, looking for anything that could confirm or contradict Harold's story. The cliff was around 130 feet high. A fall from that height could be deadly, but it wasn't always. People had survived similar drops before. But Toni's injuries told a different story. She hadn't tumbled down naturally. Her body didn't show the usual signs of an accidental fall, no scratches along her arms, no evidence that she had tried to grab onto rocks or branches to slow herself down. Instead, she had gone straight over. It was as if she had been pushed with force. The angle of her fall was steep, unnatural for someone who had simply lost their balance, and something even more disturbing stood out: she hadn't screamed. No one reported hearing her cry out for help as she went over the edge. Had she been unconscious when she fell? Had Harold struck her before pushing her over? The forensic evidence suggested one terrifying conclusion. Toni didn't slip. She didn't fall. She was thrown. The deeper investigators dug, the more Harold Henthorn looked less like a grieving husband and more like a man who had meticulously planned his wife's death. And now they had uncovered his motive. Harold had multiple life insurance policies on Toni. Together, they were worth nearly $5 million. And shockingly, she didn't even know about some of them. One had been signed without her knowledge. Another had been increased just months before she died. And the most damning discovery: Harold had tried to cash in on one of the policies less than 24 hours after Toni's death. A devastated husband mourning the tragic loss of his wife, or a man executing a plan he had been putting in place for years. Investigators now had everything they needed. They knew Harold had done it, but knowing wasn't enough. Now they had to prove it in court. Then came the moment that sealed Harold's fate. It was small, a detail that might have gone unnoticed. But in a case like this, where every move, every word, every second mattered, it was devastating. A text message. A friend had reached out, asking how Toni was doing. Harold's response was chilling in its simplicity. She's gone. But there was one major problem. Harold had sent that message hours before Toni was officially declared dead. How could he have known? At the time he sent that text, search and rescue teams were still trying to reach her body. No medical professional had yet confirmed her death. No coroner had made a ruling. And yet Harold knew, because in his mind she had been gone long before she ever hit the ground. This wasn't grief. It wasn't a panicked message from a husband in shock. It was a slip-up. And that slip-up proved that Harold Henthorn wasn't just a man who had experienced tragedy twice. He was a man who created it. Harold Henthorn had spent years crafting a persona, a devoted husband, a loving father, a man whose life had been marred by tragedy. But the evidence was too strong. The GPS records, the staged crime scene, the financial motive, and the damning text message all painted a chilling picture of a man who had orchestrated his wife's murder. And so one morning, the FBI showed up at his doorstep. Harold was calm, eerily so. He didn't protest. He didn't demand to know why they were there. Instead, he simply asked, "How did you figure it out?" It wasn't a question of innocence. It was the question of a man who thought he had planned the perfect crime. And now, he was about to face justice. In the courtroom, Harold tried to maintain the same calm, collected demeanor he had shown for years. But this time, he wasn't the one in control. Prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece, methodically dismantling the image Harold had so carefully built. Tony's family sat in the gallery, listening in silent horror as the truth about Harold unraveled before them. They had trusted him. They had believed his grief was real. But now they saw him for what he really was. And when the prosecution introduced the evidence of his first wife's death, the entire courtroom fell silent. This wasn't just about Toni anymore. This was about a man who had spent decades getting away with murder. Harold's attorneys tried to frame Tony's death as a tragic accident. They argued that hikers fall all the time, that just because Harold had been there when it happened didn't mean he had anything to do with it. But how did they explain the GPS data? How did they explain the staged fall? How did they explain the life insurance policies Toni never knew about? One by one, Harold's explanations crumbled under scrutiny. The jury wasn't just hearing the facts, they were seeing the pattern. This wasn't an accident. This was a method. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Toni's loved ones took the stand. Her colleagues spoke about how excited she had been for the anniversary trip, how much she had loved being a mother, how she had never expressed any desire to take risks or hike in dangerous areas. Then came her brother. He described the moment he got the call, the shock, the disbelief, and the guilt, because after all, Harold had been in their lives for years. They had trusted him, defended him, welcomed him into their family. And all along, he had been planning Toni's death. Their voices were raw with grief and anger. And the jury, they were watching, listening, deciding. Harold had remained emotionless throughout most of the trial. But then, prosecutors introduced a single piece of evidence that sealed his fate. The text message, the one he sent hours before Toni was officially declared dead. The moment that proved he had always known how that day would end, because he was the one who ended it. Harold looked down at the table in front of him. For the first time, his confidence faltered. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew. He was guilty. The jury took just 10 hours to reach a verdict. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. And when they filed back into the courtroom, there was no doubt about what was coming next. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreperson stood. And then 2 words: guilty, murder. Harold barely reacted. He sat silent and still as the words echoed through the courtroom. Toni's family wept. Justice was finally being served. But was it enough? When Harold Henthorn stood before the judge for sentencing, there was no more deception to hide behind. The judge didn't mince words. "You are a cold, calculating murderer. You plotted your wife's death for financial gain, just as you did before. The only reason you are standing here today is because you were finally caught." Then came the final blow. Life in prison. No possibility of parole. For the first time in his life, Harold had lost control. Harold was now convicted of Toni's murder. But what about his first wife, Sandra? Her death had been ruled an accident at the time. But with everything investigators had learned about Harold, could they really still believe that Sandra's family had always suspected foul play? But without evidence, there had never been an official case. Now, with Harold behind bars, prosecutors began reevaluating her death. Had she been his first victim, or just the only other one they knew about? Section 19, perfect crime that wasn't. Harold had gotten away with Sandra's death. He had almost gotten away with Tony's. But in the end, his arrogance was his downfall. The GPS records, the staged crime scene, the suspicious life insurance policies, the damning text message, all of it painted a picture of a man who had spent his life manipulating those around him. And now, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the question remained, had Harold done this before? Had there been other women, other accidents, other deaths that no one ever questioned? We may never know. Harold Henthorn was a man who hid in plain sight. He convinced everyone around him that he was a devoted husband, a grieving widower, a man who just had bad luck. And for years, no one questioned him. Which raises one terrifying thought: how many others like him are out there right now? How many so-called accidental deaths are actually something far more sinister? And how many killers just like Harold are still walking free? What do you think? Should Sandra's case have been reopened? Could Harold have done this to someone else? Or was he caught just in time? In the end, Harold Henthorn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But justice in cases like these is never truly simple. Because if he had gotten away with one murder before, what if he had never been caught this time? Would there have been a third victim? How many other so-called accidents have been overlooked, brushed aside as tragic misfortunes when in reality they were carefully orchestrated crimes? And the real question: should investigators reopen Sandra Henthorn's case and officially declare her a victim of murder? Or did Harold Henthorn take all of his secrets with him to prison? What do you think?